As daylight began to fade over Sacramento, the streets shimmered under the soft hues of sunset. Gold and amber streaks brushed the sky as Eric Porter navigated through traffic, ready to leave behind the weight of a demanding workday. Inside his sedan, the gentle hum of the engine and the low murmur of the radio created a cocoon of calm, a quiet buffer against the noise outside. Approaching an intersection, he eased his foot onto the brake as the yellow light turned red. In the next moment, flashing lights and the piercing cry of a siren broke the calm. Eric checked his rearview mirror, his expression tightening slightly. He guided his car to the shoulder, lowered his window, and waited as the patrol vehicle came to a stop behind him. Officer Bradley Larson emerged, a man in his mid-30s with a clean-cut appearance and the practiced demeanor of authority. His badge caught the fading light as he approached with measured steps. Without pleasantries, Larson requested Eric's documents, his voice clipped and controlled. Eric, unfazed, calmly reached for his registration and handed over his license. Every movement was precise, composed. Yet behind the surface calm, Larson's eyes searched, analyzing, as if the stop had suddenly taken on a deeper purpose. When asked the reason for the stop, Eric responded respectfully, unsure but cooperative. Larson claimed it was for not fully stopping at the light, though his delivery lacked conviction. Eric acknowledged the explanation, even if it didn't fully sit right. What followed was an uneasy pause. The interaction had shifted, subtle at first, then more apparent. The routine formality began to unravel as Larson looked more intently at the man before him. He questioned Eric's origin, noting he didn't seem like a local. Eric answered truthfully, his license reflecting his new residency. But the officer's attention was no longer on the facts. His line of questioning took on a different tone, one laced with suspicion that had little to do with traffic laws. Eric remained composed, his destination still home, but it was clear now this wasn't just about a red light. For Larson, this moment had transformed into something more personal, more defining. Eric was no longer just a commuter. In the officer's eyes, he had become something else entirely. He thought he saw something that justified a deeper look, something beneath the surface that made him pause. But Eric didn't flinch. The tension was rising, slow but steady, and though Officer Larson sensed control, he misread it. It wasn't ignorance. It was intentional. This was the opening move. Larson stepped back, folding the documents slowly, a deliberate motion meant to assert control, before slipping them into his chest pocket. His stance shifted, chin lifted, posture straightened, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. He had made a decision. Without missing a beat, he gave a command. Eric's hand tightened briefly around the steering wheel, but his expression remained neutral. He asked calmly if there was a reason for the request. Larson's face barely moved, but there was a flicker, annoyance maybe. He repeated the order, this time with a weight in his voice that needed no explanation. Eric released a measured breath and stepped out. The officer's eyes scanned him quickly, taller, broader, well-dressed. The suit, the posture, the calm, all of it hinted at precision and discipline. But none of it mattered to Larson. He motioned toward the front of the car, asking for Eric's hands in plain view. Eric complied without resistance, still composed. When he inquired again about the nature of the stop, the officer offered a vague answer, cloaked in implication. Something about routine, something about past incidents. Eric turned to meet his eyes, not with aggression, but clarity. He asked whether those incidents involved men who looked like him, businessmen in sedans, or if this was about something unspoken. The question landed with force. Larson hesitated, his face tightening, one hand unconsciously brushing the equipment on his belt. His reply came sharp, questioning Eric's tone. Eric's response remained calm. No heat, no panic. Just a steady assertion that clarity mattered. That transparency was important. Larson didn't answer. He scoffed and turned slightly, pacing a few feet, trying to reset the dynamic. But something felt off. Eric's demeanor wasn't folding under pressure. There was no trembling voice or shifting eyes, just unshaken stillness. It made Larson uncomfortable, though he couldn't explain why. The usual power balance had quietly shifted. Eric wasn't challenging him. He was simply unmoved. That quiet certainty spoke louder than any protest. Larson looked back at him and muttered as if trying to figure it out himself. "You're acting like you know how this ends." Eric didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and spoke with calm precision. It wasn't about confidence, it was about respect. Larson froze for a beat before turning back, and this time the smugness was gone. His face had hardened, edged now with defensiveness. He opened his mouth, but the reply caught somewhere between thought and speech. Eric's steady composure was throwing him off, and it showed. The silence stretched, taut and electric, as Larson began to sense this wasn't unfolding the way he'd anticipated. But rather than retreat, he pressed forward, determined to regain control. His fingers drummed against the edge of his holster, a subtle display of irritation. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone who carried themselves like Eric. His eyes darted to the sedan, as if hoping to spot something that could retroactively justify his instincts. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," he said, voice clipped and sharp. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow, repeating the word with measured disbelief. "Weapons? Do I really look like someone who's armed?" Larson's jaw tensed. His control was slipping, and the cracks were beginning to show. "I won't ask again," he snapped. Eric paused, something unreadable flickering across his face, then turned silently and placed his palms on the hood. Larson stepped forward, the crunch of his boots punctuating the thick silence. His search was fast and rough, but not purely procedural. It was a statement, a move meant to provoke, to rattle. But Eric didn't react. He stood motionless, unbothered, absorbing the intrusion without resistance. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back with clear disappointment. He hadn't found what he was hoping for, or what he needed. Eric turned to face him, unshaken, eyes steady. "Naturally," he replied. "Now if you're finished." "I'm not finished," Larson cut in, voice raised, his words rushing out too quickly, exposing the need to reassert dominance. "You seem to know an awful lot about what I can and can't do. Mind telling me why?" Eric crossed his arms, relaxed despite the heat between them. "Let's just say I've had a few encounters with law enforcement, and I've learned a thing or two." Larson's gaze narrowed. "That right? You a lawyer or something?" Eric allowed himself a faint smile. "Or something." The ambiguity lingered in the air like a challenge, and Larson didn't like it one bit. Larson moved in closer, shrinking the space between them, his voice dropping into a low, hostile tone. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you're just going to talk your way out of this?" Eric didn't flinch. He met Larson's glare with calm clarity. "I'm not trying to prove anything, officer. I just expect a situation like this to be handled with fairness, and so far, that's not what I'm seeing." The remark struck a nerve. Larson's composure cracked as he echoed the word fairness, scoffing at the idea. He began to say more, but stopped short, as if catching himself mid-sentence. Still, the implication lingered in the air. Eric noticed. His body language shifted ever so slightly, signaling he had understood what Larson hadn't said out loud. "People like me," he repeated, his voice low and deliberate, packed with unspoken weight. Larson stiffened, stepping back, a trace of regret flickering across his face. "You know what I meant?" he mumbled, though the edge in his voice had dulled. Eric nodded slowly. "I believe I do." His calm was no longer just restraint. It was cutting, pointed, challenging the very structure of the interaction. "And I also think we both know this stopped being about a traffic issue a while ago." Larson opened his mouth, but found no words. For the first time, his certainty wavered. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and Larson felt it. Then Eric spoke again, voice even but heavy with purpose. "Officer, I think it's time you understand who I am." Larson's eyebrows drew together, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Doesn't matter who you are," he snapped, though his voice trembled just enough to betray him. Eric moved his hand slowly, deliberately. "I'm going for my badge," he said calmly, watching Larson's hand hover near his holster. "There's no need for dramatics. I just want to show you." With practiced ease, Eric retrieved a leather wallet from his pocket and opened it, revealing a polished badge. Eric Porter, he said simply, Director of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larson froze in place. His eyes darted between the badge and Eric's face, hoping it was some elaborate bluff. But there was no trace of humor or deception, only calm resolve and a flicker of disappointment. Internal Affairs, he repeated, the words catching in his throat. Eric cut him off. I'm the one responsible for making sure law enforcement upholds the standards that come with that badge. That includes you. Larson's skin turned pale, the confidence draining from his posture. He stepped back instinctively, letting his hand fall away from his belt as if suddenly aware of the weight of it. Eric stepped forward to close the distance, now fully in control of a situation that had turned on its head. Eric looked directly at Larson and posed a question, his voice composed yet cutting. Do you know what the most alarming part of this entire exchange has been? Larson remained silent, his expression that of someone who just realized he had stepped into something far deeper than he expected, with no clear way out. Eric continued, saying that the real issue wasn't even the profiling, though that was bad enough, nor was it the unnecessary escalation. What truly disturbed him was how Larson had acted without ever knowing who he was addressing. He assumed Eric lacked awareness of his own rights, or the laws that officers are meant to enforce, and, more importantly, why they exist. Larson tried to speak, but nothing came out. Eric didn't let up. He pointed out that Larson's assumptions came down to one thing. He didn't believe someone like Eric was worthy of basic respect. That, Eric stated, wasn't just a personal offense. It was a systemic problem affecting everyone Larson encountered in uniform. At that, Larson's posture slumped, the full weight of what had just happened beginning to settle in. He glanced down at the badge Eric held, almost as if hoping it might vanish. Eric stepped back to give him a moment, but his tone stayed firm. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to take a step back, return my license and registration, and consider your next words carefully. Larson looked ready to argue, but hesitated too long. Eric spoke again, quieter this time, but with even more gravity. You'll hear from me again, not as someone pulled over on the road, but as the person responsible for deciding whether you're still fit to serve in that uniform. Larson swallowed, his cheeks flushed, and his hands slightly unsteady as he retrieved Eric's documents from his pocket and handed them over. Eric accepted them in silence, tucked them away, and moved toward his car. With one hand on the door, he turned and gave Larson one final look. Let this be clear. The badge doesn't put you above anyone. It holds you responsible to everyone. As Eric slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, Larson stood motionless, stripped of his usual confidence and facing an uncertain future. But for Eric, the situation wasn't ending. It was only the start. On the drive home, his mind was active, revisiting the scene not because it stood out, but because it echoed a familiar pattern. Larson wasn't unique. He was part of a larger problem Eric had seen too many times. But this time, Eric was in a position to make change. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds of Eric's office at the Internal Affairs Division in Sacramento. A file lay open on his desk, Bradley Larson. The record showed previous complaints, vague accusations of misconduct, overreach, and unexplained stops. Nothing had ever been resolved properly. Eric leaned back, steepling his fingers, contemplating the deeper issues. Larson was just a symptom. The problem was the system that let behavior like his go unchecked. And Eric wasn't interested in temporary fixes. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, entered with reports in hand. She mentioned the previous month's misconduct summary and reminded him about an upcoming departmental review. Eric nodded and asked her to set up a meeting with Chief Daniels that afternoon. She paused briefly, sensing his seriousness, then agreed and left the room. Eric turned back to Larson's file. Though his concern had widened, it wasn't about a single officer anymore. It was about a culture that normalized this kind of conduct. And changing culture meant starting at the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a meeting room. Daniels, seasoned and no-nonsense, listened carefully as Eric detailed what had happened. Eric explained that dismissing the incident as just another poor encounter would be a mistake. What had unfolded was just a glimpse of a much deeper issue. one that could no longer be ignored. Daniels acknowledged that Larson's name had come up in the past, but each time it had been dealt with quietly behind closed doors. That's exactly what needs to change, Eric said firmly. Staying silent only allows the damage to continue unchecked. It was time to confront the problem directly. Daniels absorbed the gravity of Eric's words, his expression marked with concern. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Without missing a beat, Eric proposed a full-scale departmental evaluation, not just of individual conduct, but of how the entire system operated, from training to oversight to standards of accountability. We can't expect the public to trust us if we're unwilling to hold ourselves to higher expectations. Daniels leaned forward, fingers interlaced, his voice measured. "This will cause a stir." Eric nodded. "That's exactly why it needs to happen." In the weeks that followed, Eric plunged into action. He coordinated meetings, gathered statistics, interviewed officers at all levels, and opened channels for community members to speak openly about their experiences. The incident with Larson became a spark for transformation, forcing the department to take a hard look at itself. Larson eventually faced an internal review. Eric didn't hide his involvement. He sat in the room during the hearing, watching closely as Larson was questioned. His usual confidence diminished under the spotlight. The final decision led to a suspension, but Eric knew that accountability wasn't about just one man. The real goal was preventing future abuses. Months later, Eric addressed a crowd gathered for a civic event. Police officers, government leaders, and residents filled the room. His message wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about collective responsibility. The responsibility to build a culture where justice wasn't just enforced, but practiced with integrity and dignity. True justice, Eric said, isn't limited to catching those who break the law. It's about making sure those entrusted with enforcing it do so with fairness and honor. That's the kind of badge I stand behind, and the kind of force we're working to become. The audience responded with powerful applause, but Eric didn't bask in it. This moment wasn't a conclusion. It was the foundation for what came next. As he stepped down from the stage, his eyes moved across the faces watching him. Some were skeptical, some inspired, but all were paying attention. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had begun. And for Eric, that was the first step forward. If this story moved you, share it with someone who should hear it. Help spark the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to real progress. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives, stories that push us to think, to grow, and to stand up for what truly matters.